Hello, and welcome to an AP World History lecture on Latin American revolutions. The key to understanding the Latin American revolutions is understanding the differences in the social makeup of the territory. So the social hierarchy of Latin America is very, very, very complex. So at the top you have the Peninsulares, and these are people who were born in the Iberian Peninsula. So these are the people who were born in Spain or Portugal. The second class on the hierarchy is the Creoles, and these are people who were born of both Spanish, Portuguese parents, but were born over here in the New World. Their culture is very different. They've never been to Spain or Portugal, more than likely. They've never really left Latin America. And so when it comes to, they're the true Americans during this era in regards to creating unique cultural tendencies that are separate from what you would find in Spain or Portugal. Your next class is going to be your mixed races, your mestizos, which are your Indian and Europeans, and then your mulattoes, which is your African and Europeans. A lot of those mixed groups are free and independent, but not necessarily able to own property, or may not necessarily have the same access to some of the social luxuries that the Creoles, and especially what the Peninsulares, are going to have. Your lowest level on the social hierarchy are your Native Indians and, of course, your African slaves. The Peninsulares made up of, by the time of the 1820s, make up about 30,000 of the Latin American inhabitants. Creoles are now 3.5 million. So obviously, those that were actually born in Spain or Portugal are going to be less populous. The majority of the populations are going to be in these underclasses, the slaves and mestizos and the mulattoes, and of course the Native Americans. Tapping into those groups is going to be key to the success of some of these militia movements. The Creoles, what everybody wants in regards to independence, is very different once these independence movements starts, which makes it a lot more complex than what we had up here in the United States. So what the Creoles wanted out of the independence movement was basically just independence from the crown. They didn't like the restrictions that the crown put on them, especially politically and in specific economically. A lot of the crown was still trying to maintain their economic power in this territory, and they had all these rules and regulations about trading with the British and trading with the French and where goods could go, and there was no free market economics at all. And obviously by the time we're getting into the Industrial Revolution, Spain and Portugal have not really industrialized at all, and so they're not on the global trends of economics. And so the Creoles, wanted something to change economically for sure, because there was an opportunity that they were not getting in regards to the industrial process. They're the ones who already had their established plantations. They're the landowners. They are the ones who are controlling the labor forces. So the Creoles obviously want to maintain that level of hierarchy in regards to controlling the mestizos and the mulattoes, and then of course the labor forces of the Native Americans and the slaves. They were enlightened about some ideas, but they were split in regards to whether they wanted constitutional monarchies or whether they wanted absolute republics, whether they wanted some type of equity in the system. All of that varied by region, which is going to make it very difficult for them to create any type of federated states like what we did up here. There were tiny revolts about taxes, just like what we had up here, but they had, again, this additional issue of dealing with the Peninsulares, which is not something we had, and then, of course, dealing with the massive amounts of the underpopulations. They did like what the American Constitution had set up, and they did like the system that the United States had set up. But again, when the United States was creating our Constitution, it was a very small portion of what is now the United States. So it was, just near the Appalachian Mountains, your 13 original colonies. So the geographical area that we were dealing with was very different than what Latin America had going on. Vastly different, hugely different. So all of that makes what happens in Latin America unique when comparing it to what was going on in the United States. So what ultimately causes the outbreak of major rebellions? Well, one of the biggest things is the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon decided to spread his empire throughout not only Europe, but also into Central Europe, but into the Iberian Peninsula. He puts his brother on the throne of Spain, and he is going to actually go in and start fighting for control of Portugal as well. So he basically takes over the Iberian Peninsula. So how does that impact rule over here? Well, what ends up happening is they set up the Creoles in the peninsula set up these juntas. And these juntas were kind of like these little legislative assemblies, these oligarchies, who are running the governments over here while the Spanish throne is being fought over, while Napoleon's brother is trying to establish control, who ultimately is doing what Napoleon wanted. Because there's so much chaos going on the peninsula, the Latin Americans decided that it was up to them to kind of rule their own governments and set up their own legislative assemblies, which they do. Now, there's fighting in those juntas in regards to how to run things, especially when it comes to the Creoles being involved. But really, what was going on in those juntas is just conflict between the Creoles and the Peninsulares. Obviously, the underclass are not going to be represented. The underclass, there's still slavery is still in place. The mestizos and the mulattoes' social and economic status isn't going to change as a result of any of this. So really, it was just infighting between the Peninsulares and the Creoles. Other things that's going to cause rebellion is the spread of enlightened ideas. You can see some of those enlightened ideas in what Simone Bulevar is going to write to the governor of Kingsland in Jamaica. The idea of the Enlightenment, a lot like Bolivar was educated in France, so was San Martn, and some of those ideas of separation of church and state is going to have a huge impact on the governments of Latin America, where the governments in Latin America were dominated by the power of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the only source of education in Latin America up to this point, and obviously it's a very small population that's even enjoying that education. And so there's this additional issue for control in regards to religion, which obviously with Enlightenment, the idea of a separation between church and state is going to impact that as well. Also, just your typical ideas of equality, liberty, fraternity, everything that has been discussed in regards to the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution applies here as well. The American and French revolutions are going to have a huge impact on the desire for independence and on spreading these ideas. So people were starting to hear about these revolutions, and obviously the conflict with Mexico and whatnot with the United States is going to just continue to spread those ideas. And of course, the success of the Haitian Revolution is going to impact rebellions on the continental part of Latin America as well. So let's discuss Mexico. Mexican Independence Day is celebrated on September 10th because Hidalgo, a priest, issues what's called the Grito de Dolores. And Dolores was the city where he basically decided to create this independence movement. What he wanted, the goal of his revolution was independence from Spain. He wanted to redistribute the lands of Mexico and get rid of that encomienda hacienda system, and really allowed more freedom and equity for the underclass, especially for the slaves in the mixed populations. And that racial equality aspect of his revolution is what's going to gain this massive following. So he ends up with a huge amount of kind of lower class militias who are following him and are being very successful against the Spanish forces. Remember that the Spanish forces in the Americas are going to be depleted because they're technically fighting Napoleon. So again, there's an opportunity here where the Spanish forces are less present, and so they're going to revolt at this time. The conservative Creoles are going to capture Hidalgo and actually kill him in the city of Chihuahua. That makes him a martyr for the cause, which is why the Independence Day is celebrated on September 10th, even though Mexico doesn't gain its independence for a very long time because they actually have to fight this war. The rebellions continue under the leadership of another priest named Morelos. And again, the underclass are the ones that are fighting. The Creoles actually want to establish a constitutional monarchy, which they're going to do when they ultimately gain independence from Mexico, or from Spain. The war takes until 1821, and the Treaty of Cordoba is going to give Mexico its independence, but Mexico is going to be set up as a constitutional monarchy. A Creole, Augustin Iturbide, is going to become the king of Mexico. This system is very limited. It only lasts about 18 months. The Iturbide in the Constitution that was established for this monarchy is going to be very heavy in regards to protecting the rights of the Creoles. There's not anything in regards to land redistribution. There's nothing for the underclasses. The peasants and the slaves and the mixed groups are not going to gain anything, basically, from this constitutional monarchy. So you end up with a new rebellion led by Santa Anna and Victoria, where they overthrow the constitutional monarchy on November 1st, 1823. They'll set up a republic under a constitution that lasts about 12 years. During that 12-year cycle, it's nothing but constant conflict between the conservative landowner monarchist and the liberal Republicans who wanted things like land distribution and equity. So this little republic, this first Mexican republic that lasts from 1823 until 1835, is very short-lived, and it's very filled with violence and inequality and just chaos. And so it's not really peaceful for the Mexican people. The southern part of Mexico will declare its independence through this time period with this kind of chaos, and they create their own federation called the Central American Federation, but then you end up with Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica in 1838. So all those little states will split off officially in 1838. Going down into Latin America, you need to know two individuals, into South America, Simone Bolivar and then Jose de San Martin. So we're going to discuss Bolivar first. He was an enlightened Republican Creole. He actually spent a huge amount of time in education in France, and that's where he gets his enlightened ideas. He is full-on enlightened. Like, he wants equity. He doesn't want to protect the hierarchy that's already in place. He is a unique Creole in regards to wanting to create some type of social equality for the people of Latin America. He is going to be, his first military success is in 1819 against the Spanish, where he wins independence for Colombia. And then he kind of spreads, he takes his military into Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. And as a result of that, he'll create this Gran Colombia system. And the Gran Colombia was a federation of newly independent states from the Spanish crown. And he writes his own constitution, and in that constitution he creates an executive office that's a lifetime office, and then he picks a successor. So while it looks like it's a republic in name, because it's using terms like president, in reality it's just a benevolent dictator. Bolivar really was enlightened. He really wanted to give independence to the underclass, but he also felt that kind of restrictive, almost dictatorial power is necessary because of the social constraints that this territory was under. He will go into Venezuela as well in 1820 and brings his troops in, and he was able to defeat a weak royalist army there with the help of San Martin. He officially steps down from Gran Colombia, the presidency, on January 20th, 1830, and all the little independent states will basically break off and develop into what you guys know as the modern states of Latin America. So you end up with a separate Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, etc. The other individual you need to know is Jose de San Martin. He spent a huge amount of his youth in Europe. He was educated in Europe. He was born in Argentina, but he pretty much grew up in Europe, and he serves in the Spanish military during the Napoleonic Wars. He ultimately leaves and comes back to Argentina. And there's a controversy as to why he left. Some people think that the British had something to do with it. Some people think that they convinced him to come over here and help lead the rebellions so that it would mess with Napoleon in Europe, because the rebellions over here really made things difficult for the French in regards to creating his empire, for the Napoleonic Empire. And so there's some people that think that he left because of some type of dishonorable discharge from the Spanish military. There's all kinds of issues with why he left and came over here. Ultimately, when he sets himself up into Argentinian society, he ends up being appointed into this high military office and ends up leading these massive campaigns throughout Argentina and Chile and Peru, and helps defeat the Spanish military. And after, obviously, he's going to be working with Bolivar, and he has a meeting with Bolivar on July 22nd, 1822. And after that meeting, he resigns his military position, and he leaves and goes back to Europe. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows what happened in that meeting. But ultimately, that's where Bolivar is going to manage to kind of incorporate Peru and some of the other territories into his Grand Colombian idea. Brazil's independence is a little bit different from the other Latin American states. When Napoleon shows up in Portugal, the royal family goes and hides out in Rio de Janeiro. Once Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo in 1815, King John, the king of Brazil, or king of Portugal, goes back to Portugal and leaves his son Pedro in charge. And Pedro declares independence and was crowned emperor in 1822. And he only holds that title from 1822 to 1834. He basically is a puppet for the Creoles of Brazil. Brazil's going to maintain, the Creoles are going to control everything that he does, basically. So here's just kind of a summary of what was going on in regards to the different territories. You can read through that in regards to different independence movement in like Uruguay and Paraguay. San Martin, you can see he liberates Chile and Peru. Bolivar is seen as a liberator of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and of course Bolivia. You can see that, remember that there are issues with Mexico in regards to its territory with the United States. That will be resolved in the Mexican-American War, which ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Haiti obviously will gain its independence in 1804. Remember that Cuba and a couple of the other islands will be given to the United States when the Spanish are defeated in the Spanish-American War. And also remember that during the late 1800s, the United States is going to become economically involved in Latin America on a large scale, which will impact a lot of their somewhat controversial governments that are in place today within this territory because of the economic control by the United States.